Some of the most fascinating places in New England railroad history are the spots where the sails met the rails. These were the hot spots of commerce, travel, and industry, where New England's long tradition of seafaring met its newer tradition of railroading. In places like Newburyport, Massachusetts, located at the confluence of the famous Merrimack River and the Atlantic Ocean, and once hosting a thriving railroad main line between Boston and Portland, these two ways of life often went hand in hand, lending themselves to chapters of history deeply ingrained in the fabric of the region.
In February 1836, a petition was brought forth to build a railroad through the town, across the pond to Greenleaf's Field, thence to cross Union, Titcomb, Market, and Summer Streets, thence across Merrimack Street over the Newburyport Bridge. Nearby residents strongly opposed the route, but amendments were made and a final plan was approved for the railroad tracks to pass west of the old jail on Auburn Street and under High Street with a suitable tunnel. The track from Boston to Salem was completed in 1838 and to Newburyport in 1840. In March 1840, the Eastern Railroad Company purchased the bridge and erected a new passage with two roadbeds, one above the other, to accommodate both the railroad on the upper road and carriages and foot passengers on the lower road. By June of that same year, the Eastern Railroad Company offered 3 round trips daily to Boston, and in October, the first train traveled over the Newburyport-Salisbury Bridge to northern destinations. The second railroad company to reach the city was the Newburyport Railroad, chartered in Massachusetts on March 11, 1846, and opened for business in 1851 from Newburyport to Georgetown. This company later united with the Danvers and Georgetown Railroad and the Georgetown Branch Railroad. The Danvers in Georgetown was chartered on May 7, 1851, and became operational in 1854 from Georgetown to the Eastern Railroad Junction at North Danvers. The Georgetown Branch was chartered on March 11, 1844, from Bradford to Georgetown Center. The Danvers in Georgetown united with the Newburyport Railroad on February 9, 1855, effectively completing a line from Haverhill, Massachusetts to Newburyport. The Georgetown did likewise on March 11, 1846.
The Eastern Railroad's original Newburyport station was located in downtown Newburyport near Washington Street. Opened in 1840, it was a small wooden structure with a 2-track train shed. That was replaced by a larger brick station just to the north in March 1854. And the 1854 station was destroyed by fire on March 3, 1892. A large brick structure with a turret was constructed as a replacement on the same spot.
By 1962, Newburyport Station was privately owned and in poor condition, with deep potholes in the parking lot and a station clock running more than an hour late. Service on the Boston and Maine's Eastern Route main line was cut back from Portsmouth, New Hampshire on January 4, 1965, part of a general discontinuance of the railroad's long-distance interstate passenger service. As a result of the cancellation of passenger service, on March 12, 1965, effective 7 o'clock a.m., the drawbridge was taken out of service and opened permanently. Rail stops were installed on the east and western ends of the draw. It has been long believed that poor mechanical condition of the drawbridge was the major reason why passenger service between Newburyport and Portsmouth was cancelled. We know this to be untrue because the Boston and Maine canceled passenger service to Portsmouth in 1965, around the same time that they also discontinued interstate passenger service to other cities. However, there does seem to be some truth to stories of mechanical failure, which likely contributed to it being permanently removed from service for freight traffic as well. A Boston and Maine memorandum from 1970 notes that the Newburyport drawbridge was made inoperative in 1964 on account of lateral shifting of the draw upon the draw circle track. While the bridge couldn't be opened, it could still be used for rail traffic until 1965. The reason for the mechanical failure was that the lateral shifting caused the center pin and castings to break. At that time, the railroad attempted to raise and relocate the draw span back onto its original center, which would have involved the relocation of the ends of the approach spans to allow for a matching of rail. However, once passenger service had been canceled in 1965, the bridge was permanently opened so that water traffic could pass through, and that the railroad would have to avoid making repairs. So it does seem that although mechanical failure did contribute to the bridge being permanently taken out of service for all rail traffic, it was not the only reason that passenger service between Newburyport and Portsmouth was cancelled. The last train that used the drawbridge was local freight Q3 and Q4 out of Portsmouth. That local freight was abolished after the bridge was taken out of service. A new local freight out of Boston, B27 and B28, was created to run as far north as Newburyport, while Portsmouth-based local freight Q1 and Q2 was given new operating limits that included Salisbury and out over the Amesbury branch. The only passenger service thereafter was a single round trip to Newburyport with an intermediate stop at Rowley. On April 20th, 1967, Newburyport began partially subsidizing the passenger service, but Rowley did not, and its station was abandoned. The Newburyport station was destroyed by fire on May 2nd, 1968, and the final day of Newburyport passenger service was April 1st, 1976, as the town decided to discontinue the subsidy. Service was then cut back to Ipswich. That December, however, the MBTA bought the Boston and Maine's commuter rail assets, including the Eastern Route main line up to the New Hampshire state line.
Despite the end of passenger service, freight service continued in the area. As mentioned earlier, customers north of the river in Salisbury and Hampton, as well as on the Amesbury branch, were served by a local freight running south of Portsmouth. The customers that remained here in Newburyport were served by a local freight running up the Eastern Route. One of the final customers was Owens, Illinois, whose old building can be seen behind me. The structure was built by Hytron in the 1940s and became Owens, Illinois, manufacturing blow-molded plastic bottles. Polyethylene pellets arrived in hopper cars, with boxed bottles being shipped out in boxcars. The structure was expanded about 1970 and remained a customer until 1983. Freight service to Newburyport concluded soon thereafter and has never returned. Today there are no freight customers on the Eastern Route north of Everett, Massachusetts.
It's worth mentioning that there was once a station and freight yard located near Pond Street in Newburyport. When the Eastern Railroad and the Boston and Maine were competitors, this was once the terminus of the Boston and Maine's route from Boston by way of Georgetown. The Eastern Railroad also ran to this station on the Eastern Route main line. Once the Boston and Maine had acquired the Eastern Railroad, it became less important as a terminal and station location, but the freight yard was serviced into the late 1940s and early 1950s.
On the topic of freight service to Newburyport, the City Railroad was a spur that stretched from the junction of the Eastern Railroad and the Georgetown branch down to the waterfront. Passing in close proximity to old colonial homes, the City Railroad was an important freight connection between the industrial waterfront and the main lines to Greater New England. You can see where the City Railroad crossed the street just behind me and curved along the waterfront. It last saw use by the Boston and Maine Railroad about 1969.
Nothing so completely altered the face of the waterfront as the construction of the Newburyport City Railroad. Built in 1872 for the purpose of transporting coal and freight, the City Railroad served as the link connecting the waterfront with the main line of the Eastern Railroad system. For maximum accessibility to incoming vessels, the railroad was laid out along the ends of the wharves and ran parallel to Water Street. Soon after the railroad was put into operation, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company erected a coal pocket for storing and distributing coal at the end of Granger's Wharf. When completed in 1876, the coal pocket stood over 5 stories high and towered over every other building on the waterfront. It was eventually taken down in 1932. John Legoulis remembers, each barge would come in to the right wharf. The barges were red, huge and exceptionally strong, made of large, heavy wood from chestnut trees. These barges came into Newburyport from Pennsylvania loaded and heaping with coal. They were part of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad system. They would bring the coal up to the wharfs, where it would be dumped out to people in the coal businesses. Those people, in turn, would store it in mountain-like heaps and sell it retail to people who would use it to heat their homes and businesses. The nature of the business on the waterfront gradually changed. The central waterfront and Market Square area gradually deteriorated, and by 1900, the wharves became synonymous with the wrong side of town. The area was made up of junk dealers, coal pockets, tenements, saloons, and dilapidated buildings, very different than the former hub of thriving commerce. The restoration of downtown Newburyport in the late 1960s and early 1970s gradually brought the waterfront back to economic well-being. Before downtown was restored, Newburyport demolished a great deal of the buildings downtown and along the central waterfront. In hindsight, many of those buildings most probably would have been saved.
The eastern route to Newburyport was rebuilt by the MBTA, and service to Newburyport and Rowley was reinstated on October 26, 1998. A full-length high-level platform, the MBTA's standard for new construction on routes not constrained by the need to accommodate freight operations, was built for accessibility. Since Newburyport is the terminus, trains may pull into either of the two island tracks. A 4-track layover yard was constructed south of the Newbury Turnpike for the layover and servicing of locomotives and train sets. The MBTA had originally planned to rebuild the station at the former downtown site. However, at the city's insistence, the new station was constructed a mile to the south, where parking and the layover facility could be easily built. As a trade-off, the station is a fair bit from downtown Newburyport. As part of the $2.1 million restoration project, a brick waiting room was constructed west of the tracks, incorporating 2 arches from the Newburyport YMCA building, which burned down in 1987.
Project was completed and several other major commuter rail expansions around our state. I want to thank the city and the public officials of this region. Your wonderful mayor, Mary Carrier, very grateful for all of her support, and Brenda Schwartz, the president of the mayor of Avery and Costello. Benefit to this entire region. I want to thank Congressman Candy for joining us this morning. Ensure that our air gets cleaner, and that's a big concern as we plan growth in the next century.